So in this video here, what I'm going to talk about is a couple of different ways in which insects behaviorally can find more suitable environments in which to survive and reproduce. And when insects find themselves in unfavorable environments where survival, development, and so on are suboptimal or maybe even lethal to them, they have a few different ways to deal with these situations. So we're going to talk about temperature primarily, but I'll show some examples with moisture as well. But behaviorally, they can find and locate different places in the environment that actually are more suitable for them. So let me give you a couple of examples how this might actually occur. Behavioral ways in which insects can regulate their temperature. Remember, they're ectothermic, so they've got to deal with what there is in the environment. So one way that they can actually do this is to aggregate. Insects can sometimes form different species, can form groups, and these groups can maintain body heat, can maintain local temperatures higher than the local environment in a couple of different ways. For example, the eastern tent caterpillar, Malacosoma, in the early spring will create these webbed shelters, and different individuals that are unrelated will actually cohabit these particular shelters. And these shelters slow air movement and therefore reduce dissipative heat loss. And they can also position these shelters in different orientations on trees so that they get the most amount of sun. So this is a way in which they can create a locally favorable environment when the overall environment may be unfavorable at that time of year. Okay, I just told you that insects cannot actually create their own heat. There are a few exceptions to this, and this is actually what makes insects so cool. One is the ability of insects to actually shiver. Some insects do this pretty well. Bumblebees are actually some cold-adapted species. They're furry, so they can actually maintain body heat just by their structure. That thermal layer actually prevents heat from getting lost into the environment. They can also disengage their flight musculature from their thorax, and by rapidly contracting their thoracic flight musculature, they can actually generate metabolic, or they can actually generate physiological heat. And so here you can actually see what the external temperature is when bees are active, and what their actual body temperature is. So this is the thoracic temperature. You can put a little thermocouple inside of the thorax of bees. And this is the 1-to-1 line. This is what temperatures would be if they were exactly in equilibrium with the external environment. And what you can see is that actually there are several species, including this one here, the queen of Bombus frigidus. You can imagine they do really well in frigid, cold environments. That are able to maintain their body temperatures much higher than the ambient temperatures, including at almost 97 degrees here when the outside temperature, 97 Fahrenheit, when the outside temperature is only like 50 degrees. So this is like me and you. And they're not the only ones that can do this. There's some actual solitary bees that can do this as well. This tends to be the exception rather than the norm, but it's a pretty clever adaptation nonetheless. This one here, you can chalk it up to behavior, but it's a very interesting and cool social behavior, and that is the formation of structures that actually can regulate temperatures at the colony level. This is an example of tropical African termites that create these unbelievably ornate cathedral-like structures in the savanna. And the shape of these structures, so the colony of termites actually is somewhere in here, the shape of these structures is designed so as to generate air circulation so that in very open, hot environments, like out here in the open, they tend to be more pillar-like and create more of a suction by nature of the design. They create more of an airflow by the nature of these tall chimneys. Whereas when the termite mounds, this is the same exact species, when the termite mound occurs under the understory and heat accumulation is not as critical, they actually make more dome-like mounds that look something like this, that are better at maintaining temperature under slightly lower environmental conditions. And they position their brood galleries in just the right place so that they can maintain an internal temperature of these structures at around 30 degrees C, and amazingly at a very high constant relative humidity. And this is really important because termites culture fungi that they actually use to decompose and break down the plant material that they bring in. So they need to keep this very consistent environment for the farming that they actually do. It's also important that they maintain a low carbon dioxide concentration because there's so much metabolic activity that's happening during the breakdown of the leaf material that there's a need to get oxygen in there. So it's this very careful balance between maintaining just the right temperature, just the right humidity, and then just the right airflow so that the conditions for the breakdown of their food items is maintained, and the rearing of their young is also maintained in just the right way. And so this is an example of again, like under what conditions the different types of structures are actually created. And I'll point you to this study here that kind of highlights the different ways in which those environmental conditions within a colony is maintained, depending on the structure that they form. Now, what if it's too hot? Well, maybe you and I will go to a nice place like this over here in the shade and dip our feet in the water and kind of stay cool. But if you're an insect, you might not always have the opportunity to do that. So let me show you this unbelievably cool story having to do with dung beetles living in the savanna. What you'll see in this video is this little dung beetle kind of kicking head down, kicking their dung ball around. Dung beetles actually will carve out a piece of dung from their host, will move it around away from the original dung pile, and lay their eggs in it where their larvae eventually develop. And in doing so, they're trying to get away as far as possible away from the original dung pat. And in the African savanna, temperatures can get quite hot. And so here's some interesting behavior that this little beetle does. It kicks it around for a little bit of time, and then it crawls up on top of the ball and then does this thing where it looks like it's, moving its front tarsi to its mouth, and it's kind of combing itself. And then it waits there a little bit. And then, you can't see this, but it kind of reorients itself. There's a whole other story to what it's actually doing when it's doing that. And then it climbs off the ball, and it kicks the ball off for a little bit, and then climbs up again, and repeats this over and over as it moves the ball to a safe location. So what is that all about? What is going on with that? Well, in some very cool studies done by a group in South Africa, what they actually noticed is that the hotter the temperature was, the hotter the air temperature was, the more likely the beetles were to get on top of their little dung balls. So here is a thermal image of the dung ball, and blue is cold temperatures, relatively colder temperatures, and the yellow and orange are kind of the warmer temperatures. And as you can see here, the dung ball is at a temperature that is much lower relative to the outside ambient temperature. And that's because it's full of water. Its dung is all kinds of excreta kind of mixed in, has just come out of the intestinal tract of whatever mammal this was. This is probably elephant dung. And it is at much lower temperature than the ambient temperature. And the hotter it is, the more times the beetles will climb up on top of the dung ball. Well, what happens when they climb up on top of the dung ball? So here's the temperature, or here's the period of time here. This is a time trace for about a minute. This is the time period during which they're actually kicking the ball. And what they could do with these thermal cameras is actually measure the temperature of their front legs. Remember, they're kind of legs down, front legs down, and hind legs kicking the ball. And what they can see is that their temperatures of their front legs was getting very hot. And when they reached this stage here, they would jump up on top of the ball and they would sit there for a little bit. And because that dung ball is colder, their front legs would start to cool down. When they reached a comfortable temperature, they would kick the ball again. They get off the ball and they start kicking it again. And again, they would heat up. And then they would sit on top of the ball and their legs would cool down. And when their legs got comfortable again, they'd jump on top and they'd kick it again. And they'd do this over and over, trying to maintain that temperature by sitting and cuddling up next to this dung ball there. And what you can see is that thoracic temperatures don't fluctuate as much, although they seem to be overheating here a little bit. The longer they were off the ground, the lower the tibial temperatures were. So this is, again, consistent with this idea that they were able to cool off on this cold, wet dung ball. And then they did another really clever experiment, which is they said, well, if their legs are really overheating, and this is the mechanism by which it's happening, then what we can do is actually give them some little tennis shoes here, some little protectors that keep them from actually overheating. And here's actually like these little silicone shoes that they put on their front tibia like that. And what they actually found was that the ones with the boots tended to climb up on the balls less frequently than the ones without the boots. And they also did clever things like they took the balls and they put them in a microwave and kind of heated them for a while. And the cold balls cooled down the beetles quicker, and the warm balls didn't cool them down as much. And so they tended to climb up on top, more often than not. So this is a way that behaviorally these dung beetles can actually regulate their temperature as they're moving around this really, really hot surface. It's like you and I walking around on hot sand in the in the summer at the beach. We kind of jump off on top of a cold towel or something like that, or in the water before we can kind of scamper off to our picnic or to the car or wherever it is that we're going. There's some really great other videos that I linked to in our bonus material where they do some really neat things with these beetles in terms of their orientation and how they actually know where to go with their dung balls. So you might want to check those out. So again, behaviorally, insects have all kinds of ways in which they can maintain their physiological, their body temperatures within their physiological tolerances. I talked about a couple of them, but there's all kinds of others, including fanning behaviors. Honeybees do this at the entrance of their hives. The way they build shelters, the way they can actually maintain physiological temperature in some ways, and all kinds of other ways. Dragonflies will bask themselves. Another way in which insects can deal with suboptimal environments is to just leave them. And I don't mean just leave them by moving a short distance. I mean actually migrating away from these conditions that may have switched for the worse because of seasonality, because of flooding, because of all kinds of other things. So I want to give you one example from some of the work that I was involved in, working in coastal salt marshes in the east coast of the U.S. And one of the things that is important in understanding that trade-off, there's always trade-offs in the evolution of life histories, is it better to stay and kind of weather the storm, so to speak, stay put and deal with a temporary disruption or suboptimal condition, or is it more risky to stay and it's better to leave? There's risk in leaving an environment. There's the risk that you'll end up someplace that actually is no better than where you are right now. So there's a trade-off that is inherent in making the right decision. Is it better to stay or is it better to go? And the predictability of resources, where the good food is, or where disturbance is or isn't, is what insects are trying to integrate and trying to figure out. And over evolutionary time, balances have been struck so that the decisions that are made optimize, or at the very least ensure their survival under certain kinds of conditions. So let me give you one example of this type of a disturbance and ephemerality of resources. This is some work that occurred in coastal salt marshes. Coastal salt marshes are really interesting environments. They're heavily influenced by the tides. These are at the fringe between the ocean and the surrounding land. The tides actually flood these areas twice a day. There's a kind of a high tide and a low high tide, followed by the low periods during which these areas dry out. Near these creeks, where the water will actually flow in and then eventually flood even the non-creekside areas, near the creeks, the dominant grass that grows there, the Spartina alterniflora, the salt marsh cordgrass, can take advantage of all kinds of nutrients, nitrogen in particular, that comes in with the flooding. And therefore, the plants near the creeks tend to grow bigger. They're more nutritious. We'll talk about nutrition coming up shortly, but they tend to be bigger and more nutritious, but they're also disturbed more frequently. And so if you're an insect, there's an advantage to staying near the creek sides. You get bigger, juicier, more abundant plants, but you get flooded out twice a day. So how do you deal with this kind of environment? And the contrast is out here, right behind the flood zone, is actually Spartina, the same exact species that grows really short. Rather than being, a meter tall, sometimes these plants are only 3 inches tall, 10 centimeters tall, and they tend to be lower in quality. The dominant herbivore in these salt marshes is the salt marsh plant hopper, the Spartina feeding Procalesia plant hopper. These are little homopterans. And you can see actually 2 different species here, this tan colored one and this more grayish drab colored one right here. If you were to pull out the front wings of these plant hoppers, you would actually notice, like all insects, they have 2 pairs of wings, the front wings and the hind wings. This species here, Procalesia dolus, actually has a very reduced set of hind wings that makes them not very good at flying around. The hind wings are really what power flight for this species. This species here, Procalesia marginata, actually has this very large and very flight-capable set of hind wings. And so they have 2 very different strategies. Procalesia dolus is not capable of long-distance dispersal very well, and Procalesia marginata is. And what you find is that Procalesia marginata is more common near the creek sides that have that high, juicy plant material and yet get disturbed twice a day. But they have the capacity to disperse. And so they pick up and they move around during the day as this area floods out. Procalesia dolus, on the other hand, tends to avoid those creek sides because it now has no longer the capacity to actually disperse, and rather sits on that suboptimal and rather sits on the lower nutrient quality plants. But it's evolved other adaptations to actually deal with low nutrient content. And basically it has a giant head and pumps through a lot more of that phloem tissue, and has a giant head and pumps through a lot more of plant juices to capture the lower nitrogen that's actually there. We'll talk about those kinds of feeding strategies later on. But here's an example of 2 different ways in which these species have dealt with ephemeral environments. One of them has adapted by dispersing and getting out of these areas. In the next video, we'll talk about ways in which species actually tolerate or deal with suboptimal conditions by physiological mechanisms rather than by behavioral mechanisms.